I want to welcome you to our second Heritage Shorts document detective presentation. I'm Larry Cates, reference librarian at the Heritage Research Center on the second floor of the High Point Public Library. We put together these little videos to provide a brief introduction as to how we perform research and how the resources we have right here in our little facility on the second floor of the library can be used to crack mysteries. Also, I shouldn't omit to mention that we have many years of staff experience in interpreting documents and finding out more about the parties and events involved. That knowledge, too, is an important resource on offer here. Sometimes issues can't be solved simply by searching through a search engine like Google or conducting an overarching ancestry search. Those approaches may be helpful and the answers could be online, but they may also be buried in books, located on maps, or in records that no one has indexed completely, or more likely a combination of all of those things. Also, you may not know at first which online resource is most likely to help or how to navigate that resource. That's where our collections and expertise come in. So please consider paying us a visit. Today's example explores the possibility that not everything that may help us in our family or community history efforts was put together in a court, copied into an official register, or inscribed by a federal marshal onto a census page. Governmental records aren't our only sources. Neither are private entities like newspapers or church records. Many of those materials have been preserved, digitized, and indexed for us, but the best and the most revealing records are often those kept within a family or within a local community. Our ancestors and their neighbors and friends did keep unique records for their own benefit. Maybe they wrote down a list of their family members and the key dates in the family's life in a Bible, a calendar, or a memorandum book. Maybe they wrote letters to their kin and vice versa. Maybe they kept a journal. Perhaps they maintained a record of their business transactions if they were a skilled artisan or a mechanic or a merchant. Perhaps they kept a book of recipes for food and other concoctions of use to them on a farm. University and state archives are open to collecting, describing, and preserving private materials like those when they are voluntarily donated, but more often, when folks described in them are long forgotten and the record's value seems negligible to descendants, many of whom aren't into genealogy, materials like this are thrown out or placed on the market. And that's what happened with the particular item that we're showcasing today. I've mentioned my friend Paul Payne before. He's a local historian and collector who told me about one of his friends, John Bolden, who was of like mind in that he liked to haunt auction houses looking for fragments of local history, both documents and artifacts. Part of the fun of this pursuit is serendipity. You just never really know what you're going to find on any given day. And then comes the interpretation part. What is the origin and the significance of the piece? Who created it? When was it created? Who owned it over the generations afterwards? Where did they live? And what does that item tell us about that individual's life? Collectors usually like to share their treasures with each other. They need to build networks of knowledgeable people to help them contextualize, analyze, and assign value to their collections. It's no fun to just hoard something and take it out from time to time for your private amusement. The real fun comes from sharing and exhibiting what you have, and then, too, if it has material value, you may find a suitable market eventually to reap a profit on it. Although most often that money will just recycle back into your collecting craze. Nowadays, with social media, auction sites, and apps, it's easier than ever to locate things to collect, and it's also easier to network with other like-minded people. A fringe benefit is learning about and recovering some of our history that may be otherwise lost forever or left to languish in less than ideal storage. John attended a mixed estate auction nearby where he picked up a couple of very interesting pieces, and he told Paul about them. When Paul visited me, he explained that one item contained a list of deaths and marriages across many years in the early 1800s, and he cited a few of the names that he could remember. When I heard those names, I knew they were local. I was eager to set up a meeting with John. I thought maybe he had stumbled into a missing record of baptisms and burials from a local church, perhaps a German Lutheran or a Reformed church. But I was wrong. Here's what John brought to me. Appearances are deceiving. When you look at this piece in the middle, it's quite a bit different outside than it is in. The covering is a tract, but it's not a religious tract. It's entitled Number 2, Oppression of the People. And when you read it, you discover that it was written for the campaign of Samuel J. Tilden against Rutherford B. Hayes, and it details Republican corruption during the Grant administration. So it's a political diatribe in favor of the Democratic governor of New York in his campaign for the presidency in 1876. Now, this is a very famous political campaign that ended in charges of fraud and theft of an election. There were disputed electors in at least 3 states that year that had to be settled in Congress. And coming close on the heels of the Civil War, it proved to be quite a dicey situation. Peace was only preserved by compromise, a compromise that effectively ended Reconstruction in the South in exchange for the White House staying in Republican hands. But written below in pencil on the flyleaf of the tract is, in quotes, the David Staley Diary, commenced 1814, ended 1853. But is it really a diary? Well, a list of names and dates is not a diary. In some ways, it's more like a family record, except that it details an entire community with which David was familiar, not an individual family alone. These are the people that David knew: his friends, business associates, neighbors, people who went to church with him. Some famous people also that he heard about through the news, like an occasional president's death. But mostly it's people he knew firsthand. And it's not just death in marriage records. Sometimes he puts in the cause of death, particularly if it's suicide or some other accident. He includes remedies, primarily for livestock and horses, but also for humans. Some of them are quite quaint and include bits of folk magic, like the following: a cure for the bots for a horse. Rub your fist along the sides of the horse from its breast to the root of its tail and say these words. A farmer went into his farm. He plowed 3 worms out of the ground. One was black, the other was white, the third was red. Also you shall say, these 3 worms shall die in 15 minutes in the beast stone dead. Do this 3 times, then in 15 minutes in 3 times again. There are some directions for carrying out certain kinds of farm processes, like making mash or saltpeter or tanning a calfskin white. It mentions a few fires that he heard about, like the one in the town of Fayetteville, which was an important market town a day or two's travel south from where he lived, and also the burning of the Franklinville cotton manufactory, much closer to home. He mentions unusual weather and astronomical observations, like the southern extension of the aurora borealis, which is a manifestation of the Earth's magnetic field interacting with solar radiation, which appears like a multicolored light show but is rare this far south. Comets and meteor showers are of particular interest to him. He describes briefly a few illnesses afflicting himself and his close family, particularly illnesses for his brother William and he. For his family members and other close friends, David lists the biblical texts that the Lutheran pastor selected in preaching their funerals. Sometimes he tells us the dates when relatives and friends moved west, or records when they returned to visit with his family, and even described where they lived. There are separate sections for different kinds of information, and it's not a day-by-day account of events, as we would consider a diary to be. It's not constructed in sentences and connected thoughts. We might call it a memorandum or a commonplace book. It's just a place to stash things that are important to you or that you want to remember. In a later period, it might have been filled with magazines and newspaper clippings, or stickers and stamps, pressed botanical specimens and souvenirs, as well as thoughts and events. So who was this man? Well, in this case, I didn't have to wonder who he was, although I could have easily found out the basics about him in census records or on Find a Grave. It wasn't the first time that I had run into his name or his family, because he, in fact, by some miracle of happenstance, was my ancestor's brother, the ancestor that you see pictured here in the middle. That is William M. Staley, who was the brother of David Staley. And this is the family that he describes and who it seems eventually took over this book when David died in 1853. They lived between Liberty and Julian in the extreme northeast corner of Randolph County, North Carolina, near the Guilford County line. The other folks mentioned in the book lived across 4 counties, from Sandy Creek to Rocky River and north to Alamance and Stinking Quarter Creeks, because this is the place where 4 counties meet, the counties of Randolph, Guilford, Chatham, and Alamance, which for much of the book's lifetime was Orange County before it became Alamance. In fact, in a different handwriting at the end, William Staley, the brother, my great-great-great-grandfather, noted the death of his brother David himself and added a few extra entries of deaths and marriages that occurred subsequent to his brother's death. You can see the handwriting changing on the 2 pages pictured. But William did not carry David's practices much further forward. He did keep his brother's little book, and eventually, after the election of 1876, he sewed it into the campaign pamphlet to protect it. Over the years, successive owners kept it among their papers until someone eventually placed it in an initial auction where no one wanted it. And finally, it was sold in a mixed lot of remnants for a nominal amount. David Staley was never married. He never had children that we know of. He was a farmer and a tanner. He lived with and cared for his parents, Joseph and Margaret Staley, when all his other siblings had left the area except his brother William. The family kept a handful of people in slavery, and David also mentions some of them when they died in his record. When his father succumbed in 1851, David was left alone, aside from the remaining enslaved people. He himself died shortly thereafter in 1853. Perhaps he had lost some sense of his purpose, or maybe I'm just reading too much into his death. The Commonplace book, however, even though it isn't chatty, even though it doesn't reveal feelings directly, it does reflect a few things about David. First, it shows that he was curious about and interested in the world in which he lived. He was eager to hear all the news. He turned his gaze at night to the stars and wondered what he saw there might mean for him. In a world transformed very quickly by scientific marvels like steam engines and mechanical presses and telegraphs, his universe was still unpredictable, subject to disease, departure, blight, murrain, and bad weather, as most farmers' lives were. Magic, inherited from his Germanic background, still seemed useful in easing his uncertainties. His jottings reveal that he felt tightly intertwined with members of his community, which centered around his church, which was Richland Lutheran Church, and so many people mentioned in his account are from that church. For instance, he tells how one of his cures came from the wife of his minister who was serving there at the time. At one point, he refers to a tale he heard that a man living near Lincolnton had the secret to cure cancer. People shared their medical knowledge and folk wisdom, such as it was in those times. Doctors were of secondary importance in this era, often only called under very extreme circumstances. Most people just fended for themselves, and they used their inherited wisdom to tackle their health challenges. David was extremely interested in horses and tended them carefully. We know that horses and humans can form incredibly close bonded partnerships, one might even say friendships, and these relationships apparently were important to David because he had a lot of wisdom about trying to take care of his horses. From young adulthood, David was afflicted with swellings in his legs from time to time that hampered his work and forced him to use a cane for certain periods. His recurrent health issues may have affected his marriage prospects. Maybe that is why he was so interested in the marriages of the other people in his community. Maybe he felt diminished or slightly sidelined by his own situation. We also see some reflection of how migration separated families, and how precious written documentation and communication and occasional visits were. And just because these people were no longer to be seen didn't mean that migrating family and friends were absent from the day-to-day thoughts of those that they left in the East. Writing down their names kept them present. And last of all, The very preservation of the document indicates how important David was to his family, particularly to his brother William. By keeping this book, William kept David and his preoccupations fresh in his memory. And apart from knowing something about David himself, what is this book's significance? Well, a cynic might say it lost its importance the day David died. It may have served his purposes, but how does it serve ours? Why is it worth keeping, especially if we are unrelated to him? I probably don't need to explain this to this audience, but I will in case there are skeptics. First of all, the recipes here are amazing. They give us ideas about cures for various ailments of humans and animals and bits of traditional folk magic. That's cultural history for which we have very few other sources, because most people weren't interested in recording the thoughts and traditions of average people. Some events like local fires might not be recorded anywhere else, like a fire in the piney woods that he mentions, which was apparently a nearby brush fire of some magnitude and importance. The causes and dates of death for various people are priceless. Why? Because there were no death certificates in the 19th century in North Carolina. Unless a family record, a church burial register, a personal letter, or tombstone survives, there are just no other places that these dates are recorded. And durable, legible tombstones cost considerable money at the time and had to be brought in from other places, like Fayetteville. Most people usually just use local rocks or wooden markers that rotted in the early 19th century. Now, there are records like probate materials, wills, and estates that may give a rough idea of when someone died, but usually not a precise date. However, these are only for property people, principally landowning men and others who had business affairs that needed settling after death. Many deaths of children, women, and poor people they're going to be included here. And those are deaths that are difficult to document otherwise. And then there are all the marriage dates. Now, unfortunately, David only gives us one partner in any given marriage for the most part. But the dates are priceless because at least half of North Carolina marriages before 1868, or maybe more than half, left no civil record behind. You didn't need a license to get married. You could just ask your local minister to announce that your marriage was about to take place on 3 successive Sundays during church services, and if no one objected, you could then be legally married without a license. Such marriages left no trace in the public records, and church records regarding them are quite rare, and it was just cheaper to do it this way than to go to court and get a bond. But David definitely did leave traces for us here. And finally, pre-1868 marriage records, when they do exist, are merely bonds taken out days or weeks ahead of time to ensure the legality of the marriage that was about to take place, but they do not prove that a marriage actually happened. In fact, we know sometimes people got cold feet. A bond might be executed, but no marriage would follow. And they certainly don't usually give the date of the solemnities, but David records those for us. I'm descended from David's family, but the entries he includes in this leaflet provided at least a dozen deaths and marriage dates for other unrelated ancestors that I couldn't get from alternative sources. The one I'm most happy about is the death of Isaac Cox Sr., which he records took place on either the 29th or the 30th of October, 1831. Now, Isaac Cox appears in the 1830 census of Randolph County in the same northeastern quadrant of the county, and he's aged 70 to 80, so he was born in the 1750s. And his wife, Elizabeth Marley, was born in the prior decade in the 1740s. She appears with him, but no one else lives in the house other than perhaps a daughter or granddaughter or a housekeeper. A few years earlier, Isaac had sold his land on Sandy Creek to James Cox, his son, my ancestor, who was a country merchant. So when Isaac died, he had no significant property remaining in his own name. There was no will or estate record when he died, probably because there was no significant outstanding debt to be settled. His son James assumed all of his effects and took his widowed mother in. If there was a tombstone for Isaac, which would likely have been at Sandy Creek Baptist Church, where his son is buried about 10 years later, it's lost, destroyed, or illegible. A similar story could be told about many others whose names appear in this book. In all, some 60 pages of records. And to think they were saved essentially by a series of accidents. Successive generations in the family thought enough of their relative to keep the book. When the last concerned individual died, it ended up in the hands of a person who didn't see its value, and an auction house assumed custody. And then a network of collectors redeemed it and delivered it to a person who could resurrect it and make it usable for others. In fact, that person just happened to have a personal connection to the family in the region and was aware of these connections through years of patient study. Of course, I'm referring to myself. But you could be that person. Admittedly, some of our ancestors' private and community records are long gone, destroyed, out of reach. Many of them, letters, diaries, business accounts, scrapbooks, commonplace books, photo albums, Bible records, are still floating around among the general public, all but invisible to us. Let me suggest that there are still ways of finding them. If you still live near your ancestors' stomping grounds, make connections with local auction houses and antiquities and rare book dealers who frequently come across such items. Ask to be notified of their finds. Make the rounds of local antique stores regularly. Forming connections with the collecting community can definitely help, and your discoveries don't have to be directly connected to you. You may still be the agent by which orphaned items get into the best possible hands. Your library's local history department, like ours, can help you research the provenance and the personalities behind anything that you find, and perhaps even suggest contacts for restoring the material to the appropriate hands. And don't forget the online auction sites like eBay, where random documents come up frequently for sale. You can even construct standing queries for items so that they will pop up into your email when something appears for sale of particular interest to you. In addition, sometimes you can obtain access to heirlooms through conscious efforts to make connections. If you want to do that, you must emerge from the tunnel vision of tracing just your direct ancestors. It often pays to branch down to remote living cousins, people that we've never met before, and methodically contact them, sharing what we've learned through our research while asking for any leads on personal items that may have descended in their lineages. Social media and public records or people tracing sites make that easier now than it has ever been. But if you take this approach, let your newfound cousins know that you're not interested in acquiring the items themselves so much as documenting them and preserving data about them. It's also a good idea to pledge respect for the privacy of the current owner with regard to any content that you share, so that custodians won't be endlessly harassed by unwanted inquiries. And by the way, for those of you with an interest in the Staley Commonplace book, we've transcribed the contents and placed them in our Staley file and also in our Liberty area file under Randolph County in the Heritage Research Center. Also, there are facsimiles of the original so that you can look at both the transcription and the original side by side. You can come to view those anytime that you please. The transcription is slated to be published also in this year's first issue of the Randolph County Genealogical Society Journal, and we welcome other similar source material pertinent to our region of North Carolina. Although we cannot preserve the originals here, we can certainly image documents and place copies in our files for others to access, providing you, as a donor, with as much transparency or anonymity as you desire. Publicly generated records can and do answer many of our genealogical questions, but these sources can never speak intimately to us about our ancestors that their own record keeping can. It makes sense to go the extra mile to delve deeper and get closer to our forebears before more of the hidden legacy that they left behind disappears into trash bins or disintegrates into vermin-infested fragments. You too can be an agent of preservation.